The autumn morning carried a crisp chill that seemed to settle deep into the bones of everyone gathered at the Royal Air Force Base. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood beside her husband Prince William as he prepared for what would be his most challenging deployment yet. The wind caught her hair, sending auburn strands dancing across her face, but her eyes never left his. William adjusted his flight suit one final time, his movements precise and practiced, yet there was something different about him today. His usual confident demeanor carried an undercurrent of emotion that only Catherine could recognize after their years together. They had faced many separations before, but this mission to provide humanitarian aid in a conflict zone would keep them apart for 3 months. The couple had arrived at the base before dawn, wanting these precious final moments away from the cameras and crowds that usually followed their every move. Catherine had insisted on driving herself, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as they navigated the quiet country roads leading to the airfield. William had reached over several times during the journey, covering her hand with his, offering silent comfort. Now, as they stood beside the aircraft that would carry him away, the weight of their goodbye pressed down on both of them. Catherine wore a simple navy coat, her usual elegant attire replaced by something more personal and comfortable. She had chosen this outfit specifically because William had once mentioned how much he loved her in that particular shade of blue. The flight crew moved around them with respectful distance, understanding the gravity of this private moment between husband and wife. Squadron Leader Matthews, William's longtime friend and fellow pilot, caught Catherine's eye and nodded reassuringly. He had promised her personally that he would look after the prince, a promise that meant more to her than any official military assurance ever could. William turned to face his wife fully, his hands finding hers naturally. They had practiced this moment in their minds, knowing that their goodbye would likely be captured and shared around the world, despite their efforts for privacy. But in this instant, surrounded by the mechanical sounds of the airfield and the distant chatter of ground crews, they might as well have been alone in their own living room. Catherine's fingers traced the Royal Air Force insignia on William's chest, a gesture both tender and proud. She understood the importance of his mission, the lives that could be saved through the aid deliveries he would be making. Her own charitable work had shown her the desperate need in the regions where he was headed. But understanding the necessity didn't make letting him go any easier. The morning sun began to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the tarmac. William glanced toward the aircraft, then back to Catherine, his internal struggle visible in his eyes. As a husband, every instinct told him to stay with his wife and children. As a future king and current military officer, duty called him toward dangerous skies and uncertain circumstances. Catherine noticed his hesitation and stepped closer, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the airfield. She reminded him of all the families who would receive the medical supplies and food his flights would deliver. Her words carried both encouragement and her own inner strength, the same strength that had carried her through years of public scrutiny and royal responsibilities. The couple's 3 children had said their goodbyes at home the evening before. Prince George, with his serious expression so much like his father's, had asked detailed questions about the mission. Princess Charlotte had made William a small drawing to carry with him, while Prince Louis had simply clung to his father's leg, not fully understanding why Papa had to go away, but sensing the emotional undercurrent in the household. Catherine reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small photo, one taken during their last family vacation to Scotland. The image captured all 5 of them laughing together on a beach, completely natural and unguarded. William's eyes softened as he looked at it, tucking it carefully into his breast pocket where it would stay close to his heart throughout the deployment. The base commander approached discreetly, indicating that departure time was approaching. William nodded acknowledgement but made no immediate move toward the aircraft. Instead, he took Catherine's face gently in his hands, memorizing every detail as if he might forget during their time apart. Catherine leaned into his touch, her own hands covering his. She had learned over the years not to let her fear show during these moments. William needed to see her strength, to know that she would be holding everything together in his absence. The children, their royal duties, the countless obligations that never paused for personal circumstances. She would handle it all. But beneath her composed exterior, her heart was breaking just a little. 3 months felt like an eternity when she was used to sharing every day with him. Their partnership had grown stronger through each challenge they faced, and being apart always felt like losing half of herself. William pressed his forehead against hers, and in that moment they weren't the future king and queen of England. They weren't public figures with the weight of a nation's expectations on their shoulders. They were simply two people in love, facing the temporary pain of separation that millions of couples around the world understood all too well. The aircraft engines began their startup sequence, filling the morning air with a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. Catherine felt William's grip on her hands tighten slightly, his reluctance to let go evident in every line of his body. Around them, the world continued its preparations for his departure, but time seemed suspended in their small bubble of intimacy. Catherine knew that in just minutes she would watch his plane disappear into the distance, beginning the longest 3 months of waiting she had ever faced. But for now he was still here, still hers, still the man who had chosen her above all others. The morning light grew stronger as other aircraft began their own preparations around the airfield. Catherine could hear the distant sounds of military personnel going about their duties, but her focus remained entirely on William's face. She studied the small scar above his left eyebrow, earned during a childhood polo accident, and the laugh lines that had deepened over their years together. William's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand, a habit he had developed during their university days when exam stress would make her fingers tremble. Now it was his own hands that needed steadying. The mission briefing had detailed the risks he would face, flying into regions where conflict made every landing dangerous and every takeoff uncertain. Squadron Leader Matthews approached them once more, this time with obvious reluctance. The other members of the humanitarian mission were already boarding their aircraft, and the flight window was narrow. William acknowledged him with a slight nod, but still made no move to leave Catherine's side. Catherine noticed the slight tension in William's jaw, the same expression he wore during difficult state functions when protocol demanded one thing, but his heart wanted another. She had learned to read these subtle signs over their years together, understanding that his sense of duty often warred with his personal desires. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of aviation fuel and autumn leaves. Catherine's coat fluttered around her legs, but she barely noticed the cold. Her attention was completely absorbed by the man standing before her, memorizing this moment before it became just another memory to sustain her through the coming months. William glanced toward the aircraft where his gear had already been loaded. His personal kit contained letters from each of their children, written in their careful handwriting and sealed with colorful stickers that Charlotte had insisted upon. George had included a detailed map he had drawn of the region where his father would be serving, complete with notes about local wildlife he had researched in the palace library. The couple had spent the previous evening going through logistics that most families never needed to consider: secure communication schedules, emergency protocols, and the careful coordination required to maintain royal duties while one half of their partnership was half a world away. Catherine had taken detailed notes, her organizational skills coming to the forefront as they always did during challenging times. But now, standing on the tarmac with departure imminent, those practical conversations seemed less important than simply being present with each other. Catherine reached up to adjust William's collar, a wifely gesture that had nothing to do with royal protocol and everything to do with caring for the person she loved most. William caught her hand as she smoothed the fabric, bringing her fingers to his lips for a gentle kiss. The gesture was so natural, so unconscious, that neither of them realized a photographer with a long-range lens had captured the moment from across the airfield. That single image would later become one of the most beloved photographs of their relationship, showing their genuine affection away from formal settings. The base chaplain had offered to conduct a blessing before the mission departure, but William had politely declined. His faith was personal and private, something he preferred to keep between himself and God. Instead, Catherine had whispered her own prayer for his safety the night before, her words meant for divine ears alone. Catherine's sister Pippa had called early that morning, offering to come stay at the palace during William's absence. The gesture was typical of her family's supportive nature, but Catherine had gently declined. She needed to prove to herself that she could handle this separation with the same grace she brought to all her royal responsibilities. The aircraft captain emerged from his final pre-flight checks, catching William's attention with a respectful salute. Time was running short, and weather conditions in their first destination were expected to deteriorate later in the day. Every minute of delay could impact the safety of the entire mission. William's military training kicked in, his posture straightening as duty began to override personal emotion. Catherine recognized the shift immediately, having seen him make this transition countless times over the years. The loving husband was gradually being replaced by the focused officer, a transformation that was necessary but always slightly heartbreaking to witness. Catherine stepped back slightly, giving him space to begin his mental preparation for the mission ahead. But her eyes never left his face, drinking in these final moments together. She knew that in just minutes she would need to smile and wave as his aircraft departed, presenting a composed facade for the media and public who would be watching. The other wives and families of the mission crew had gathered near the base operations building, offering each other support and companionship during these difficult goodbyes. Catherine could join them if she wished, finding comfort in shared experience and mutual understanding. But something kept her rooted to this spot beside William, reluctant to break the intimate bubble that surrounded them. William's radio crackled to life with final departure instructions. The tower was clearing their flight plan, and ground crews were beginning their final safety checks. The mechanical sounds of preparation created a backdrop of urgency that both of them tried to ignore. Catherine thought about the empty bed that would greet her tonight, the absence of William's quiet breathing beside her, and the way he always reached for her hand in his sleep. Their morning routine would be disrupted, missing his terrible jokes over breakfast and the way he always stole the last bite of her toast. But she also thought about the families in war-torn regions who would receive aid because of his mission. Children who would have access to medicine, mothers who would feed their families, communities that would receive hope along with essential supplies. William's absence would serve a purpose greater than their personal comfort, and that knowledge would help sustain her through the lonely weeks ahead. William checked his watch, a gift from his grandmother that had accompanied him on every deployment. The time for departure had arrived, and further delay would compromise the mission's schedule. He looked at Catherine with an expression that mixed love, regret, and resigned determination. The moment had arrived that both of them had been dreading since the mission orders came through 6 weeks ago. William's hands moved to Catherine's shoulders, his touch gentle but firm, as if he could somehow transfer his strength to her through that simple contact. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting their shadows long across the tarmac and warming the air just enough to remind them that life continued its normal rhythm, even as their personal world shifted. Catherine looked up into William's eyes, those familiar blue depths that had first captured her attention during their university days at St. Andrews. She could see the conflict there, the same struggle between duty and desire that had defined so much of their life together, but she could also see his resolve strengthening, the mental armor he wore when facing difficult responsibilities clicking into place piece by piece. The aircraft engines had reached their full warm-up cycle, creating a steady thrum that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. Other crew members were completing their final equipment checks, moving with the practiced efficiency of professionals who understood that delays could mean the difference between life and death for the people they were going to help. William's thumb traced the line of Catherine's cheek, a gesture so tender and familiar that it might have been choreographed by their years together. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for just a moment to memorize the feeling of his palm against her skin. When she opened them again, she saw her own reflection in his eyes, and something passed between them that needed no words. Catherine had spent weeks preparing herself mentally for this moment. She had researched the regions where William would be serving, understanding the challenges and dangers he would face. The knowledge didn't make his leaving any easier, but it helped her feel more connected to his mission and the important work he would be doing thousands of miles away. The base photographer, who had been discreetly documenting the departure of the humanitarian mission, lowered his camera as he witnessed this intimate exchange. Some moments were too personal to capture, too sacred to turn into official documentation. He would have plenty of formal photos of the prince boarding the aircraft and waving goodbye, but this quiet tenderness belonged only to the couple sharing it. William's military colleagues had learned over the years to respect these private moments between him and Catherine. They understood that the strength of their relationship directly impacted his effectiveness as an officer and leader. A pilot who knew his family was secure and supported could focus entirely on the dangerous mission ahead. The flight manifest included medical supplies destined for 3 different refugee camps, emergency food rations that would feed hundreds of families, and water purification equipment that could serve entire villages. William had studied the delivery points extensively, understanding not just the logistics but the human need behind each destination on their route. Catherine straightened his flight suit one final time, her movements automatic and caring. She had performed this same ritual before every deployment, every training exercise, every official flight he had taken during their marriage. Her hands knew exactly which straps needed adjusting, which pockets contained his essential items, which details required her attention. The communication device clipped to William's belt would be their lifeline during the coming months. They had tested it thoroughly, establishing times for their daily calls that would work around both his mission schedule and her royal duties. The technology seemed almost magical, allowing them to hear each other's voices across continents, but Catherine knew it would be a poor substitute for his physical presence. Squadron Leader Matthews appeared at William's shoulder once more, this time with obvious urgency. Weather conditions at their first destination were beginning to deteriorate ahead of schedule, and the window for safe landing was narrowing rapidly. Every minute of delay reduced their margin for error and increased the risk to the entire mission. William nodded acknowledgement to his colleague while keeping his eyes on Catherine's face. She could see him gathering himself, pulling on the professional persona that would carry him through the dangerous weeks ahead, but she could also see the husband and father underneath, the man who would rather be anywhere else than preparing to leave his family behind. Catherine reached into her other coat pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in tissue paper. William looked at her quizzically as she pressed it into his palm, her fingers lingering over his as he unwrapped it. Inside was a simple wooden heart, carved by Prince Louis during his craft time at school. The 7-year-old had painted it red with careful brushstrokes, adding small gold dots that were meant to represent stars. William's composure nearly broke as he looked at his youngest son's gift. Louis had worked on the project for weeks, keeping it secret with the determined focus that only children could maintain. The little prince had explained to Catherine that the heart would keep Papa safe because it was full of love from home, and the stars would help him find his way back to them. The gift represented everything William was leaving behind, and everything he was fighting to protect and serve: his family, his children's innocence and creativity, the peaceful life they had built together within the constraints of royal duty. He tucked the wooden heart into his breast pocket beside the family photograph, keeping both treasures close to where they could provide comfort during difficult moments. Catherine saw the emotion threatening to overwhelm her husband and stepped closer, her voice barely audible above the aircraft noise. She reminded him that 3 months was not forever, that they had survived separations before, that his return would make their reunion even more precious. Her words were meant to strengthen both of them, acknowledgement that this goodbye was necessary but not permanent. The tower began broadcasting final departure clearances over the radio system. Ground crews were stepping away from the aircraft, their safety checks complete and all systems verified. The massive cargo doors had been sealed, protecting the humanitarian supplies that represented hope for thousands of people living in desperate conditions. William glanced toward the aircraft one final time, then back to Catherine's face. The moment they had both been dreading and postponing had finally arrived. There could be no more delays, no more stolen minutes together. His duty was calling, and years of military training and royal responsibility had prepared him to answer that call, even when every personal instinct screamed in protest. William pulled Catherine into his arms with a desperate tenderness that spoke louder than any words could express. She melted against him, her head finding its natural place against his chest where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. For these precious seconds, the noise of the airfield faded away. The urgency of departure schedules became irrelevant, and the weight of royal protocol disappeared entirely. Catherine breathed in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the crisp morning air, trying to memorize the sensory detail that she would miss during their separation. William's arms tightened around her, as if he could somehow keep her with him through the strength of his embrace alone. His lips pressed against the top of her head, a kiss that carried months of love and longing compressed into a single moment. The base commander had positioned himself at a respectful distance, understanding that this farewell required privacy, despite the public nature of the departure. Other personnel moved around them with careful awareness, creating a buffer of space that allowed the royal couple these final intimate moments together. Catherine felt William's slight tremor as he held her, the only outward sign of the emotional storm raging beneath his composed exterior. She tightened her own grip around his waist, offering her strength to support him just as he had supported her through countless public appearances and private challenges over the years. When they finally separated, both of their eyes were bright with unshed tears. Catherine reached up to touch William's face one last time, her fingertips tracing the familiar contours of his jaw and the small dimple that appeared when he smiled. She wanted to memorize these details that photographs could never fully capture, the tiny imperfections and beloved features that made him uniquely hers. William caught her hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss into her palm before folding her fingers closed around it. The gesture was one they had shared since their early dating days, his way of giving her a kiss to keep when they had to be apart. Catherine smiled through her emotional overwhelm, touched that he remembered this small ritual from their youth. The aircraft captain emerged from the cockpit, his expression apologetic but firm. Weather conditions were worsening at their destination, and further delay would mean postponing the mission by 24 hours. The humanitarian supplies they carried were desperately needed, and every hour of delay potentially meant lives lost in regions where medical care and food were critically scarce. William nodded his understanding, his military training taking precedence over his personal reluctance. He straightened his shoulders and took a step back from Catherine, beginning the psychological transition from husband to officer that every deployment required. But his eyes never left her face, drinking in these final moments of her presence. Catherine forced herself to smile, the same radiant expression that had charmed the public for over a decade. But this smile was different, more personal and infinitely more precious. It was meant only for William, carrying her love, her pride in his service, and her promise to be waiting when he returned home safely. The ground crew chief approached with William's flight helmet and final equipment check. Everything was ready for his departure, from the sealed cargo holds full of aid, supplies to the flight plan that would take him across multiple time zones to regions most people only heard about in news reports. William accepted his helmet but continued to hold Catherine's gaze. In her eyes he could see his own reflection and something deeper, the unshakable faith she had in his abilities and his safe return. That confidence would sustain him through dangerous flights and difficult conditions, reminding him that someone was counting on him to come home. Catherine stepped back to give him space to complete his departure preparations, but her movement was reluctant and slow. Every instinct urged her to grab his hand and refuse to let him leave, to find some way to keep him safe beside her instead of sending him into harm's way. But duty and love sometimes demanded the same sacrifice, and she understood that his service was an extension of their shared commitment to helping others. William moved toward the aircraft with measured steps, each one taking him further from Catherine and closer to his 3-month deployment. Other crew members fell into formation around him, the camaraderie of shared purpose evident in their coordinated movements. These men and women would watch out for each other in the challenging weeks ahead, forming a temporary family united by their mission. Catherine walked alongside them as far as the security perimeter would allow, her heels clicking against the tarmac in rhythm with their boots. The base photographer documented these moments with careful discretion, understanding that these images would become treasured memories for both the royal couple and the British public who followed their story. At the base of the aircraft steps, William turned back toward Catherine one final time. The distance between them was small in feet but felt enormous in emotional impact. She raised her hand in a small wave, and he responded with a gesture that was part military salute and part loving farewell. Squadron Leader Matthews paused beside William, offering Catherine a respectful nod and a quiet promise that he would look after her husband. The commitment in his eyes was genuine and comforting, a reminder that William would not be facing the challenges ahead entirely alone. The aircraft steps seemed to stretch endlessly upward as William began his ascent. Each step took him closer to the cockpit, where he would spend the next several hours flying toward his deployment zone, but further from the woman who had become his anchor and his strength. Catherine watched his progress with forced composure, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from trembling. She had practiced this moment in her mind, preparing herself to maintain dignity and grace even as her heart broke with temporary goodbye. The public would be watching, but more importantly, William would be watching, and she needed him to see her strength rather than her fear. At the top of the steps, William paused and looked back one final time. The morning sun caught the gold in Catherine's hair and illuminated her face with ethereal beauty that took his breath away even after all their years together. She was everything good and pure in his world, and the memory of her standing there would sustain him through whatever challenges lay ahead. William raised his hand in one final farewell, a gesture that carried the weight of 3 months of separation and the promise of eventual reunion. Catherine lifted her own hand in response, her fingers spread wide as if she could somehow reach across the growing distance between them. For a moment that felt suspended in time, they held each other's gaze across the tarmac. Husband and wife, future king and queen, but most importantly, two people deeply in love facing temporary goodbye. Then William disappeared into the aircraft, and Catherine felt a piece of her heart follow him inside. The metallic clang of the door closing echoed across the airfield with a finality that made her breath catch in her throat. She stood perfectly still, watching the sealed aircraft that now contained the most precious person in her world. The engines began their takeoff sequence, the sound building from a low rumble to a powerful roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Catherine's feet. She remained in position at the security perimeter, her eyes fixed on the aircraft windows, hoping for one last glimpse of William's silhouette. Other family members and base personnel had gathered near the operations building to watch the departure, but Catherine felt utterly alone in the crowd. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency, completing final safety checks and clearing the runway for takeoff. The tower communications crackled with clearance codes and weather updates, the professional language of aviation that would govern William's life for the next 3 months. Catherine found strange comfort in these routine procedures, reminders that her husband was surrounded by competent people, following established protocols designed to keep him safe. The aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, moving slowly at first but gaining momentum with each passing second. Catherine walked along the perimeter fence, keeping pace with the massive plane that carried her husband away from her. Her heels clicked against the concrete in a rhythm that matched the beating of her heart, too fast and slightly unsteady. As the aircraft reached the runway threshold, Catherine stopped walking and pressed her hands against the chain-link fence. The metal was cold against her palms, a sharp contrast to the warmth of William's hands just minutes earlier. She could see the cockpit windows now, dark and reflective in the morning sun, hiding the crew who were completing their final pre-flight checks. The radio tower cleared the humanitarian mission for takeoff, and the aircraft engines reached full power. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out every other noise on the base and filling the air with the raw energy of mechanical flight. Catherine felt the vibration through the fence and into her bones, a physical reminder of the forces that were about to carry William thousands of miles away from her. The massive plane began its takeoff roll, accelerating down the runway with surprising grace for something so large and heavy. Catherine followed its progress with her eyes, her neck craning upward as the aircraft lifted off the ground and began climbing into the pale morning sky. The landing gear retracted with mechanical precision, and the plane banked gently toward the east, following the flight path that would take it over the English Channel and across Europe toward regions torn by conflict and desperate need. Catherine stood motionless long after. The aircraft had disappeared from sight, leaving only contrails in the sky and the fading echo of engine noise in her ears. The airfield seemed eerily quiet now, with ground crews returning to their normal duties, and the dramatic intensity of departure giving way to the mundane rhythm of a typical military base morning. Squadron Leader Matthews's wife approached Catherine with gentle understanding, offering silent companionship from someone who had experienced countless similar farewells. The women stood together without speaking, sharing the unique bond of military wives who understood that loving a service member meant regularly surrendering them to duty and danger. The base chaplain appeared at Catherine's other side, his presence comforting without being intrusive. He had officiated at many deployment ceremonies and understood that some goodbyes required quiet witnessing rather than spoken consolation. His weathered hands were folded peacefully, and his expression carried the patient wisdom of someone who had, helped many families navigate the challenges of military service. Catherine finally turned away from the empty sky and began walking back toward the base operations building. Her steps were measured and deliberate, the public composure that had been drilled into her through years of royal training, taking over from the private emotion she had shared with William. But her eyes remained bright with unshed tears, and her grip on her purse was tight enough to leave marks on the leather. The base commander met her near the building entrance, expressing formal appreciation for the prince's service and assuring her that every resource would be dedicated to the mission's success and safety. His words were professional and sincere, but Catherine barely heard them. Her mind was already following William across the sky, imagining his current location and wondering what he was thinking as familiar landscapes disappeared beneath the aircraft's wings. Inside the operations building, a secure communication station had been set up for Catherine's use. The equipment would allow her to maintain contact with William throughout his deployment, bridging the physical distance with technology that seemed almost miraculous. But as sophisticated as the communication systems were, they could never fully replace his physical presence beside her. Catherine looked at the communication terminal and made a mental note of the schedule they had established for their daily calls. Time zone calculations were posted on the wall, helping family members coordinate with deployed personnel scattered across different continents. She studied the numbers and charts, trying to make the abstract concept of global deployment feel more manageable and less overwhelming. The drive back to Windsor was quiet and contemplative. Catherine had chosen to drive herself again, needing the solitary time to process the morning's emotional intensity. The familiar countryside passed by her windows, but her thoughts were focused on an aircraft that was now crossing over foreign territories, carrying her husband toward challenges she could only imagine. At a red traffic light, Catherine reached into her coat pocket and withdrew her mobile phone. No messages yet, which was expected since William would be focusing on flight duties for the next several hours. But she stared at the blank screen anyway, already anticipating the moment when it would light up with his first communication from abroad. The photograph appeared in newspapers around the world 3 days later, capturing the exact moment that had touched millions of hearts. The image showed Catherine and William in their final embrace on the tarmac, her head against his chest and his lips pressed to her hair, surrounded by the machinery of military deployment, but completely absorbed in each other. The photographer who captured the moment, James Richardson, later said he had nearly deleted the image, feeling it was too private for publication. But something about the raw emotion and genuine love displayed in that simple embrace convinced him that the world needed to see this glimpse of authentic human connection amidst the formal protocols of royal duty. Social media exploded with responses to the photograph. Comments poured in from military families who recognized their own experiences in the royal couple's goodbye. Mothers wrote about watching their sons deploy. Wives shared stories of airport farewells, and veterans recalled their own difficult partings from loved ones. The image had transcended celebrity, fascination to become a universal symbol of love, persevering, despite necessary separation. Catherine first saw the photograph while reviewing media coverage in her private study at Kensington Palace. She had been preparing for a scheduled visit to a children's hospital, trying to focus on her royal duties to distract herself from William's absence. When her private secretary showed her the newspaper, she stopped breathing for a moment, transported back to that windy morning and the feeling of William's arms around her. The image showed details she had not remembered consciously, but her heart had recorded perfectly. The way William's hand had curved protectively around the back of her head, the slight wrinkles in her coat from leaning against him, the closed eyes that spoke of both pain and acceptance. It was more intimate than any official portrait, more revealing than any carefully staged photo opportunity. Catherine touched the newspaper gently, her fingertips tracing the outline of William's face in the grainy newsprint. 3 days into his deployment felt like 3 weeks, and seeing this visual reminder of their last moments together brought both comfort and fresh longing. She could almost feel his presence again, the warmth of his embrace and the steady rhythm of his breathing. The hospital visit that afternoon took on new meaning for Catherine. As she moved through the pediatric wards, meeting children whose parents were deployed overseas, she found herself connecting with their experiences in a more personal way. A 7-year-old girl named Emma, whose father was serving in Afghanistan, shyly approached Catherine and whispered that she had seen the prince's goodbye picture in her grandmother's newspaper. Emma confided that her daddy had hugged her the same way before he left, and that she kept a photo of that hug under her pillow to help her not feel so sad at bedtime. Catherine knelt down to Emma's eye level, understanding completely the child's need for tangible connections to an absent parent. They talked quietly about missing someone you love and counting days until they come home safely. Later that evening, Catherine sat in the family's private quarters with Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, looking through photo albums and sharing stories about their father. The children had handled his departure with remarkable resilience, but she could see the subtle signs of his absence in their behavior. George had become more serious and protective. Charlotte was asking more questions about when Papa would return, and Louis had started carrying around a small toy airplane that he claimed would bring his father home faster. Catherine's phone buzzed with an incoming secure call, and all 3 children immediately perked up with excitement. William's voice came through clear and strong from thousands of miles away, and suddenly the vast distance seemed manageable again. He spoke to each child individually, asking about their schoolwork and activities, sharing appropriate details about his mission, and expressing his love with the easy warmth that made him such a devoted father. When it was Catherine's turn to talk privately with William, she mentioned the photograph that had captured global attention. William confessed he had seen it too, transmitted through secure military channels by concerned colleagues who wanted to ensure he was comfortable with the public response. Rather than feeling exposed or embarrassed, he said the image reminded him why his work mattered and why he needed to return home safely. William described his first few days of deployment, carefully balancing honesty about the challenging conditions with reassurance about his safety and well-being. The refugee camps where they were delivering aid were heartbreaking in their desperation, but also inspiring in the resilience and hope of the people they were helping. Every successful supply delivery felt like a small victory against suffering and injustice. Catherine shared updates about the children's activities and her own royal engagements, but also the smaller details that couples miss when separated. The way Charlotte had insisted on making her bed exactly like Papa taught her, how George had asked detailed questions about aircraft navigation during their science lesson, and how Louis had announced to his entire class that his Papa was helping people who didn't have enough food. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, spanning topics from mundane household details to profound discussions about service and sacrifice. When they finally said goodbye, both Catherine and William felt renewed strength for the challenges ahead. The photograph that had moved millions had also reminded them of their own deep connection, powerful enough to bridge any distance and sustain them through any separation. Over the following weeks, the image continued to resonate with people around the world. Military support organizations reported increased donations and volunteer participation. Marriage counselors noted that couples were using the photograph as a discussion point about showing affection and support during difficult times. The tender moment had somehow encapsulated universal truths about love, duty, and the courage required to let someone you cherish serve something greater than themselves. Catherine kept a copy of the photograph on her desk, where she could see it during her daily work. It served as both inspiration and comfort, reminding her that their love story continued even across vast distances. William carried a smaller version in his breast pocket, next to the family photo and Louis's wooden heart, creating a collection of talismans that connected him to home. The photograph became more than documentation of a royal farewell. It transformed into a symbol of enduring love, proof that genuine emotion could transcend protocol and public scrutiny. In years to come, it would be remembered as one of the most moving images of their relationship, capturing a moment when 2 people in love faced temporary goodbye with grace, dignity, and unshakable devotion. Military families adopted the image as their own, seeing in it recognition of their daily sacrifices and silent strength. The photograph validated their experiences and honored their service in ways that official ceremonies sometimes failed to achieve. It showed that love and duty could coexist, that personal sacrifice could serve public good, and that temporary separation could actually strengthen the bonds between people who truly belong together. As the weeks passed and William's deployment continued, Catherine would sometimes pause in her royal duties to look at the photograph and remember that morning on the tarmac. The image captured not just a goodbye but a promise. A promise that love would endure, that duty would be fulfilled, and that reunion would come. In that simple embrace, the world had witnessed something both extraordinary and utterly human. A moment of pure connection that proved some things remained constant even in an ever-changing world. The few, tender goodbye that moved millions became a testament to the power of authentic love displayed without artifice or calculation. It reminded everyone who saw it that beneath titles and responsibilities, protocol and public service, two people had found each other and chosen to face life's challenges together. That choice, renewed in moments of separation and reunion, formed the foundation of a love story that continued to inspire hope in others seeking their own enduring connections.